RHill here. I did my Critcal Media Project on as classic James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. I was actually fortunate enough to have the opportunity to do this as a novel study with my fourth graders this year. To me, critical literacy is so much more than literacy that is strictly on pencil and paper. It allows my students and ourselves to communicate with tons of people in a great deal, whether that's in our community or in our nation or even around the world through different types of digital mediums and using different technology. Critical media literacy to me also includes utilizing and being able to utilize different media literacies in order to discover new information in a variety of ways, as well as deliver information in a variety of ways using digital media resources. And so we're taking that into account as we read and view our book film combo, which of course is James and the Giant Peach. Now, whenever we compared and contrasted James and the Giant Peach in class, my students were super engaged in the discussion. We discussed the storyline. For the most part, the storyline is very similar as far as James's parents getting killed early on by the rhino. In the movie, they depict the rhino as a cloud. Also, his aunts, this is a difference here. The death of his aunts. In the novel, his aunts are rolled over by the peach in the novel, and they are killed immediately. In the movie, they are in their car whenever the peach rolls over them and does not kill them. So that was a major difference. That was an upsetter in the classroom. Also, the bug characters. All of the characters in the novel, the centipede, the green grasshopper, the earthworm, they were all major parts of the novel, as well as the ladybug and the spider and the glowworm and the silkworm. However, in the movie, there is no silkworm, so that just kind of shook things up a bit. Also, the only person in the novel who is a character other than James or a human that wears clothing is the centipede, who's obsessed with his boots for all of his feet. In the movie, all of the characters have clothing. For example, Mrs. Spider has clothing here. She has on her boots and her hat and her bandana, very accessorized, whereas in the novel, there is no mention of her having any sort of clothing on. Also, you do have the centipede here. You can see that he has on a hat, a cigar, a shirt, suspenders, and pants, and also he has fewer legs in the film than he does in the actual novel. Next, as far as comparing and contrasting goes, in the movie there is lots of singing. It almost turns into a musical, which in the novel itself, the main singers were the centipede and the green grasshopper. So that was a major difference. Also, the earthworm, he is pretty much the same throughout the novel and the movie. He is whiny and sad, and he bickers with the centipede all the time. So that was a definite similarity as well. When it comes to catching the seagulls, in the movie they did not have the silkworm's help to help them catch those seagulls. Instead, they relied on a web that Miss Spider had already spun in order to throw it over top of all the seagulls to catch them in the net instead of lassoing them one by one. So that was a major difference that we noticed and discussed in class. Also, this brings me to my next topic, the mechanical shark. In the book, there were tons of sharks that were simultaneously attacking the peach, which was very troubling. And in the movie, there is a mechanical shark that shoots out of his mouth like a mechanical dagger of sorts that sticks into the side of the peach and is pulling the peach closer and closer to the mechanical shark. So that was a huge difference between the novel and the movie. Also, this brings me to my next point, which are the different endings. As far as endings go, they did, both in the novel and in the movie, they both landed in New York City. So that was a definite similarity there. However, how they landed were different. In the movie, they land on top of the Empire State Building, and it's much more symbolic. In the novel, whereas in the novel, it's a chance for new beginnings for all of the characters. The silkworm gets to spin silk, the centipede gets to run in races, and the ants are dead. So in the movie, the ants come back in a very soggy car to take James back with them to the house on the hill. However, in the novel, those ants, Ant Sponge and Ant Spiker, have already passed. Whenever they were crushed by the peach. So that was a major difference as well. Like I have mentioned, I used James and the Giant Peach as a novel study at the end of the year with my fourth graders. I did a folder activity that included different ELA and science standards, which I will show you here momentarily. We did comprehension activities using Padlet responses and iPads, which was a great way to integrate critical media literacy into the classroom. I had students create their own vocabulary lists using Quizlet, and they would quiz each other during our ELA block. Also, we discussed animal adaptations, which was a great way to incorporate science, and I was able to use a plethora of resources there. We discussed behavioral and physical adaptations, which we had already been learning about in science. It was great to do some integration. They were able to do an online research project about an animal of their choice or an animal from the novel. They also looked up information using GetEpic, which they loved. We used Duckster.com, which is a safe, guided search engine that has tons of resources on there, as well as National Geographic Kids and Ranger Rick. At the end of the year, we did a celebration with the movie, and the kids were then encouraged and provided with guidelines in order to compare and contrast the movie and the novel. And we had great discussions with that, and included some Padlet responses that they loved, and would come up with the questions on their own. So it was a great way for the students to use those critical media literacies that they've been learning through and utilizing all year long, as well as critical thinking with creating their own discussion questions. This also brings me to Common Core state standards that I aligned with the project. I had my students refer to details and examples in text when explaining what the text said in complete sentences, and they were able to draw inferences as well. We determined the theme, we described our characters in a graphic organizer, as well as the settings and events in the story and the movie as well. They had a written response, like I said, with the Padlet. They determined meanings of words using the Quizlet. They also explained the major differences between the novel and the movie, referring to the different elements that made that up. Like I said, they did compare and contrast the points of view from which the different stories were narrated, and in the novel and in the movie, and also they accomplished that end of the year goal, which accomplished that last Common Core state standard for reading literature for the 10th goal for 4th grade. Also, I was able to incorporate and integrate science standards as far as discussing the animal adaptations by them being able to give examples of adapting to an organism's environment, how animals meet their needs by using those behaviors, and as far as physical and behavioral adaptations, and also how humans adapt to their environments as well. So it was just all encompassing, a great way to integrate science standards. Next, that brings me to my final piece, the strengths of using a novel that also has film as a great way to integrate critical media into the classroom. There were definite strengths. It is always great to use classical literature whenever you can. Roald Dahl always produces great pieces of literature, and it also, by using the critical media literacy aspect with this novel study and film comparison, it engages my students and all students in that critical thinking aspect, that higher order thinking that is so important to their all-around learning. I did encounter some challenges as far as my book or my school having enough copies to go around for all of my students, and also with meeting my ESL and ELL learners where they are. I did make modified novel studies, but it did, there were lots of things that took a little extra time, which of course I did not mind, but that was a definite challenge that I encountered as we went through the novel study. Also, some implications was a definite understanding of comparing and contrasting before we entered into this activity, and obviously weaving in the critical media literacy aspects throughout the novel study. That was so important to the overall success of the project. That's the end. I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed creating it. It was a great way for me to further my knowledge on critical media literacy and explore new areas in my teaching and curriculum. Thank you so much.